Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes is the new book by Morgan Housel, who you probably know from his mega bestseller, Psychology of Money. Now, while Psychology of Money was about timeless lessons on wealth, greed, and happiness, it was very focused on succeeding financially. Same as Ever is a little bit in between a psychology book and a history book. If you really liked Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene or The Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant, books in kind of those veins that help you understand how humans function both individually and at scale, then this is probably a book that you will really enjoy. The way Morgan has structured it, it's, I believe, 23 chapters. So yeah, 23 little stories about things that never change. So in each chapter, is like less than 10 pages. They go pretty quickly. They're full of little stories and anecdotes to help you get each of the ideas. And what I really like about this book is that it not only helps you understand the world a little bit better, but in some ways it helps you predict the future. Because the point of the book is to talk about the things that are the same as ever, the things that are not going to change. And if they're not going to change, then we can assume they will probably continue to be true, and we can use them to make better decisions, and so on. Now, let's talk about this theme of things that never change, because right off the bat, he explains part of where he got the idea for this topic of the book. He says, things that never change are important because you can put so much confidence into knowing how they'll shape the future. Jeff Bezos said it's impossible to imagine a future where Amazon customers don't want low prices and fast shipping. If you know that your customers are always going to want those things and will always be happy if they get better, then it makes a lot of sense to continue focusing on improving those things. Whereas if you're just chasing the latest trend or fad all the time, you might not ever really succeed because you don't get those like long-term compounding gains that you would get by focusing on the things that will be the same in 10, 20, 30 years. So what are some of those things that you could think about and focus on? Well, one of them is risk. Right? Because we all take on a certain amount of risk in our lives. We're exposed to a certain amount of risk. And you probably want to know how to mitigate risk to a reasonable degree in your life. And so one of the lessons in the book is risk is what you don't see or what you don't see coming. He says, The Economist, a magazine I admire, publishes a forecast of the year ahead each January. Its January 2020 issue does not mention a single word about COVID-19. Its January 2022 issue does not mention a single word about Russia invading Ukraine. That's not a criticism. Both events were impossible to know when the issues were planned in the months before publication. But that's the point. The biggest news, the biggest risks, the most consequential events are always what you don't see coming. So to a certain extent, you can never be fully prepared for all the risks or all the bad things that could happen because the bad things that will happen will be the ones that you aren't prepared for, right? But despite knowing that you can never be prepared or you can never mitigate all risks, there is a way to be more prepared, right? Housel says, 1, think of risk the way the state of California thinks of earthquakes. It knows a major earthquake will happen, but it has no idea when, where, or of what magnitude. Emergency crews are prepared despite no specific forecast. Buildings are designed to withstand earthquakes that may not occur for a century or more. Nassim Taleb says, invest in preparedness, not in prediction, and that gets to the heart of it. And he goes on to say that risk actually gets worse when you think you can predict the things that are coming because you might under-prepare for them. It's almost better to just be heavily over-prepared for all the bad things that could happen so that whenever bad things inevitably do occur, you're not as heavily damaged by them, right? So invest in preparedness, not in prediction, because risk will always be what you don't see. So then the next lesson or set of lessons that I really liked was around numbers and how a lot of the world is driven by these kind of like crazy unexpected events like we talked about in the risk chapter, and also that we are not great at handling the odds of things happening. We usually want yes, no, binary answers for if something is going to occur, if you should be worried about something, but usually the answer is some percentage, right? It has a 60% chance of occurring or something like that. Housel says that probability is about nuance and gradation, but in the real world, people pay attention to black and white results. If you said something will happen and it happens, you were right. If you said it will happen and it doesn't, you were wrong. That is how people think because it requires the least amount of effort. It's hard to convince others or yourself that there could have been an alternative outcome when there's a real-world outcome sitting in front of you. The core here is that people think they want an accurate view of the future, but what they really crave is certainty. We're not good at, or we don't actually even want accuracy. We want to feel like we already have the answer. He goes on to say, someone who tells you there's a 60% chance of a recession happening doesn't do much to ease that pain. They might be adding to it, but someone who says there is going to be a recession this year offers something to grab onto with both hands, something that feels like taking control of your future. We really, really feel good when somebody gives us a strong answer on something, even though that strong answer is probably at least partially wrong. And so the challenge for you is, can you think a little bit more in terms of percentages like that? You also want to think more like a poker player, right? Where you're trying to make decisions with the highest likelihood of a good outcome while knowing that you could make the right decision and still get the outcome you don't want. And it's a tricky thing, right? Just because you get a bad outcome doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. And you have to be kind of comfortable with that. And be okay with not having black and white, yes, no answers to everything. Because the other thing he says in here that's really powerful is that unlikely things can happen all the time. They actually should happen all the time simply because of the number of unlikely things there are that can happen. Housel says, this is part of why the world that's part of why the world seems so crazy and why once in a lifetime events seem to happen regularly. There are about 8 billion people on this planet. So if an event has a 1 in a million chance of occurring every day, it should happen to 8,000 people a day, or 2.9 million times a year, and maybe 250 million times during your lifetime. Even a 1 in a billion event will become the fate of hundreds of thousands of people during your lifetime. And given the news media's insatiable appetite for shocking headlines, the odds are nearly 100% that you will hear about these events when they happen. So it should be no surprise that you hear about some crazy, unbelievable, unexpected, awful thing happening every day, because there are so many people and the world is so big and we have access to so much information now that you're just going to hear about it because the odds are actually very high that a crazy, awful thing will happen somewhere in the world on any given day. Another way to think about this is if something has a 1% chance of happening or it's a 1 in 100-year event, well, the odds of that one event happening in a given year is only 1%, but there are probably more than 100 of those things that could happen. So the odds that one of them will happen in a given year are actually quite high, right? Almost 100%. So you shouldn't be that surprised when an unexpected thing happens because, again, there are so many unexpected things that can happen. Now let's go on to this chapter about storytelling. The title is The Best Story Wins. Stories are always more powerful than statistics. And he highlights something really quite powerful here because I don't know if you've seen this, call it a controversy, whatever, where there's a certain chunk of the internet that thinks that Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari is a bad book because he gets things wrong. Some things are a little too dumbed down. There are much more advanced history and anthropology books out there, but Housel explains why that stance is wrong. He says, C.R. Hallpike is an anthropologist who once wrote a review of Harari's new book on the history of humans. The review states, it would be fair to say that whenever his facts are broadly correct, they are not new. And whenever he tries to strike out on his own, he often gets things wrong, sometimes seriously. It is not a contribution to knowledge. Then Housel says there are two things to note here. One is that Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Sapiens, has sold over 28 million books, making him one of the best-selling authors in any field, right? I mean, 28 million books is insane. And Sapiens is the most successful anthropology book of all time, right? So this critic may be saying something accurate, but obviously the book has succeeded incredibly well despite that. But then the second interesting thing about this is that Harari doesn't seem to disagree with this assessment. Harari says, I thought this is so banal. There's absolutely nothing there that is new. I am not an archaeologist. I'm not a primatologist. I mean, I did zero new research. It was really reading the kind of common knowledge and just presenting it in a new way. What Sapiens did that was so powerful was it took all of this existing knowledge and it created a really great story out of it. And that's why it's the best-selling anthropology book of all time, because it's not who has the freshest research or the most accurate analysis or any of those things. It's who can tell the best story, because that is what's really going to resonate with people. Housel says author Bill Bryson is the same. His books fly off the shelves, which can drive the little-known academics who uncovered the things Bryson writes about crazy. One of his books, The Body, A Guide for Occupants, is basically an anatomy textbook. It has no new information, no discoveries, but it is so well written and he tells such a good story that it became an instant New York Times bestseller and the Washington Post Book of the Year. So again, it doesn't matter if you're even the most correct, right? What matters is how good of a story can you tell, because that is what people are going to latch onto. I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just want to take a moment to tell you about Readwise. If you haven't used Readwise, it is the absolute best app for anybody who loves reading. I use it to read all of the articles online. I think it has the best in class article reader. I also use it to save my highlights and notes from everything that I read. So if you're reading something on Kindle or iBooks, it will just automatically pull out any highlights that you take and save them for you and send them to any note-taking tool that you use. And if you read physical books, like I do, I'll just mark with little sticky tabs as I go, and then I can use my phone to take pictures of the page and automatically scan in the highlights. It is so helpful for getting the most out of every single book I read, making sure that I can find any quotations or ideas I really loved in the future. If you're a serious reader, you absolutely need this tool. You can go to readwise.io/nat to get a 2-month free trial. It's a month longer than they normally do, and it's a great way to help support the show. So again, just go to readwise.io/nat and check it out if you haven't already. And let's get back to the episode. All right, so then let's move on to this chapter. Calm plants the seeds of crazy. Crazy doesn't mean broken. Crazy is normal, and beyond the point of crazy is also normal. And this touches on a favorite topic of mine, something I've talked about in a bunch of the other books that I've covered on my YouTube or in this podcast, which is this like cyclical nature of society and history and how we seem to move in these cycles throughout time, where we get into good phase, and good phase leads to the bad phase brings back to the good phase, right? Or politics seems to move in cycles, right? Like the Democrat and Republican Party in America seem to rotate around each other and steadily adopt each other's policies as they keep kind of like moving around some center. We see cycles in religion, we see cycles in trusted institutions, like all of these things go through cycles throughout history. And what Housel explains here is that when things are very calm, that is what naturally leads to disaster. And he's talking about Hyman Minsky, who spent most of his career as an economist at Washington University in St. Louis, was fascinated by the boom and bust nature of economies. He also thought the idea of eradicating recessions was nonsense and always would be. His seminal theory was called the financial instability hypothesis. When an economy is stable, people get optimistic. When people get optimistic, they go into debt. And when they go into debt, the economy becomes unstable. So his big idea was that stability is destabilizing. And we see this everywhere, right? The more stable, secure, safe, reliable things feel, the more risk we start to take on. And then the more risk that we take on, the more risk we start to take on, the closer we get to something eventually breaking down. And so in this example here, Housel is saying that a lack of recessions actually plants the seeds of the next recession, which is why we can never get rid of them. It's kind of like forest fires, right? If you try too hard to prevent forest fires, you're just leading to an eventual much larger, much worse forest fire. You need to clear the brush out in order to prevent something really terrible from happening in the future. And this is an idea that Nassim Taleb talks about a lot in Anti-Fragile as well, if you want more on that subject of like having an appropriate amount of damage to a system in order to actually make it stronger. Next, let's move on to the chapter Too Much, Too Soon, Too Fast. A good idea on steroids quickly becomes a terrible idea. And this opens with one of my favorite little quip stories, whatnot, where Housel says that Warren Buffett once joked that you can't make a baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant. You'd be surprised, though, how common it is for people to attempt to speed up a process beyond what it can handle. This is just one that resonated really strongly with me because I often want to try to make things go fast. I want to try to speed it up, figure out the tactics I can use to, shortcut the system a little bit, not have to wait as long as, I might be told that I have to wait. But sometimes trying to push things too hard actually makes it break. And sometimes you can't even push it much faster than you want to. A lot of really great things take time. Or that's the power of compounding interest and whatnot, is that it takes a while for it to work, but it works very reliably. And something we've seen a lot in recent years are companies and then trying to grow as quickly as humanly possible, building a very unsustainable business in the process, and then crashing and burning, right? Like WeWork is sort of the seminal example of this, but we've seen so many other examples since then, again, of companies raising tons of money, and then we have this kind of like mini tech recession over the last couple of years, and it turns out they're not worth anywhere close to what they thought they were, and they have all of this like extra debt burning them down because they were trying to go too quickly. And he talks about how trying to do too much too fast can like really hurt you everywhere. But one area that he mentions that resonated with me was like with creativity, where he says Robert Greene writes that the greatest impediment to creativity is your impatience, the almost inevitable desire to hurry up the process, express something, and make a splash. If you're trying too hard to go too quickly, too fast, or try to shortcut the process, you're just going to do worse work. Now, if you are kind of like on fire and you're feeling amazing, you're like, oh my God, this is just, everything's clicking, right? So, well, that's an energy you can lean into. And then you can go really quickly during those periods. But if you're trying to force yourself to move really quickly with a creative work, like a book or a song or something, you're probably going to end up making a worse product as a result than if you took the time to step back, let things bubble up, right? It's very common, and he talks about this later too, that like people go on a vacation or something and then they have a big insight, right? Like sometimes you have to go slowly and give yourself space for those great ideas to happen. And I'll just give you one more example here because I thought it was really interesting where, and I'll just give you a summary. Basically, these biological researchers figured out that they could make fish grow faster by heating the water. And so they had like two sets of fish, and in the one, they controlled the temperature to make the fish grow faster. They grew 15%. Let's see. Okay, it doesn't say how quickly they grow, but in the warm water, they grow faster. Cold water, they grow slower. But here's the interesting thing. The fish with slowed down growth go on to live 30% longer than average, whereas the fish with the faster growth die 15% sooner. So there's a cost to going too quickly. You want to be willing to let things go slowly, and they'll end up being more durable as a result. Next is this idea that maybe you want to create a little more stress and challenge in your life. The chapter is called When the Magic Happens. And what he talks about is how a lot of the greatest advances in technology tend to happen during periods of immense stress, often during wars, right? A lot of the technology that we enjoy today came out of the military-industrial a lot of technology we enjoy today came out of the military-industrial complex around like World War II and the Cold War, right? Like the whole space race led to so much innovation. And if you're overly comfortable, then you're not particularly motivated to create new things to solve problems, right? So he says the same people with the same intelligence have wildly different potential under different circumstances. And the circumstances that tend to produce the biggest innovations are those that cause people to be worried, scared, and eager to move quickly because their future depends on it. This is even an interesting way to explain why the children of rich parents very often don't go on to do much and might end up just like losing the fortune. They don't have that same pressure to perform, that same drive to succeed, that drive to earn, because they've had everything given to them. And so even though they might be as smart and as capable as their parents, they don't have that same pressure. And so they're just not really motivated to do anything. So even if you aren't in debt, have a comfortable life, all of those kinds of things, finding a way to put a little extra pressure on yourself might actually be very helpful for performing better. You might not want to be too comfortable. Then let's talk about good news versus bad news, because there's a really powerful idea here in the chapter Overnight Tragedies and Long-Term Miracles, where Housel says that good news comes from compounding, which always takes time, but bad news comes from a loss in confidence or a catastrophic error that can occur in the blink of an eye. So bad things tend to happen really quickly, good things tend to happen slowly. And that's why it can sometimes feel like there are more bad things happening in the world at any given moment, because the bad stuff is always like this big news event, right? It's the invasion, it's the, sudden sickness, it's the building that falls down. Whereas the good news is, oh, we had like slow and steady economic growth that brought more people out of poverty for years and years and years. But there was no like one big event that was the incredible piece of news that got everyone's attention. And the other thing he says related to that is that a lot of progress and good news concerns things that didn't happen, whereas virtually all bad news is about what did occur. So there's just more to talk about with bad news. There's two ways to use this insight. Like one is to recognize that even if you're mostly hearing about bad things, that doesn't mean that most of what's going on in the world is bad. It's just that the good stuff is less interesting and there's usually less to talk about there. It also means that for your own life, you might feel like more bad things are happening, but you have to also think about the little ways in which you're making progress and like making an impact on your long-term goals. And this is why little things like journaling or tracking progress, finding ways to celebrate the wins can be very helpful, because if you are just making slow, steady compounding growth towards some future, but there aren't those big events along the way, you might not feel like anything is happening, even though you are getting closer to your goals. So just remember that the good stuff happens slowly, you might not notice it. The bad stuff happens very quickly, and you'll usually be very aware of it. On that note, actually, is balancing pessimism and optimism, because if you're too optimistic, then you won't see bad things in your environment that could be getting in your way. And if you're too pessimistic, then you're just going to have a very unhealthy relationship with reality. So Housel says you want to find a good balance of these things. This is in the elation and despair chapter. He says the best financial plan is to save like a pessimist and invest like an optimist. That idea, the belief that things will get better, mixed with the reality that the path between now and then will be a continuous chain of setback, disappointment, surprise, and shock, shows up all over history in all areas of life. So this is, I think, just fantastic financial life, whatever advice, right? Save like a pessimist, assume you're going to need more than you think, and invest like an optimist. Assume the future is going to be like very bright and wonderful, because if you have a long enough time horizon, it's almost guaranteed to. He has this chart somewhere, maybe it's in Psychology of Money, basically that in a given year, there's only a 52% chance that the stock market is up, but on a 30-year timeline, there's like a 98% chance the stock market is up. So if you're thinking in the long term, then you're going to succeed. like it's going to get better over a long period of time. But if you want those wins to happen very quickly, you're going to be disappointed because of all these little like setbacks along the way. So invest like an optimist and save and prepare like a pessimist. Okay, so I found where he's talking about, travel and taking time away from your work, and that's in the Casualties of Perfection chapter. He says, every person I've worked with comes back from vacation saying some variation of the same thing. Now that I've had some time to think, I've realized with a few days to clear my mind, I figured out while I was away, I got this idea. And he says that part of why that happens is that when we're in our normal day-to-day work, we're often too optimized, where we're just go, go, go all the time, and we don't have time to step back and think and reflect on what we're doing. And sometimes we need that space in order to make these like bigger strategic decisions, especially if you do anything creative or that requires a good amount of deep work. So he calls this casualties of perfection, because if you're too perfect in your work routine, you might actually be hurting yourself. You might be a little over-optimized on the wrong things. So you want to create some space, you want to create some slack in your system so that you have the opportunity to take those long walks and think about what you're focused on, or to sit back and like kind of get that 30,000 foot view, because it can be really, really helpful for making these like step function improvements in whatever it is we're doing. And he's got this great line here where he says that just like evolution, the key is realizing that the more perfect you try to become, the more vulnerable you generally are. And what he means by evolution there is that if an animal is too hyper optimized for one environment, then the moment that environment changes, they die. So you want to be an animal that's very adaptable to like all environments, and isn't super perfect in one and can move to another if something changes, right? This is actually a decent argument for how humans have succeeded so much, because we're basically the only large mammal that spans the entire globe. Because we are hyper adaptable. We can live in basically any climate. I mean, even space, right? No other animal can do that. And that's because we're not really perfect at any one thing, but we're very adaptable and very capable in general. All right, just a few more here. This chapter I really loved. It's titled, It's Supposed to Be Hard. Everything worth pursuing comes with a little pain. The trick is not minding that it hurts. And what he's talking about here is that it's very tempting to look for shortcuts, look for quick ways to win so that we don't have to do the hard work, right? We don't want to diet. We just want to take a pill that's going to solve our problems. We don't want to work out. We want to get plastic surgery or something. We don't want to sit down and write for 4 hours a day. We want to find some hack so that we can write faster. We don't want to put in the work. And sometimes you hear about somebody succeeding despite not putting in the work, and it makes it very tempting. It's like, okay, if I could just figure out how they did that, then I could do it too. But typically you gotta actually do it, right? And if you're just looking for shortcuts all the time, you're more likely to just end up wasting a lot of time and energy instead of actually getting good at whatever it is you're saying you want to do. And so he's quoting Seinfeld here, and Seinfeld says that if you're efficient, you're doing it the wrong way. The right way is the hard way. The show, Seinfeld, was successful because I micromanaged it. Every word, every line, every take, every edit, every casting. If you're efficient, you're doing it the wrong way. And Housel says that's so counterintuitive, but it perfectly highlights the danger of shortcuts. Part of this is simply understanding the cost of success. And he goes on to say that Bezos talked about the realities of loving your job. And Bezos says that if you can get your work life to where you enjoy half of it, that is success. And I think a lot of us have this myth in our heads. I certainly do, that you should enjoy all of your work. And if there's something that you're not enjoying, then you're doing it wrong. You should figure out how to like get that off your plate. But I actually think this is a much healthier way to look at it. If you can enjoy half of your day, if you can enjoy half of your work and get through the rest of it, that's really good. Most people don't even get that. And you should be okay with that because, yeah, it's supposed to be hard. It's not supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be entirely pleasant. And if it is entirely easy and pleasant, you're probably going to lose to somebody who is willing to put in that bigger, harder work. And speaking of putting in that hard work and not expecting it to just be easy and allow yourself to get lazy, he has this other chapter towards the end called Keep Running. And the point of this chapter is that we often get a little bit of success and then we get comfortable and we give up and we stop. He says, people often work hard to gain a competitive advantage for the intended purpose of not having to work so hard at some point in the future. Hard work is in pursuit of a goal, and once that goal is met, the relaxation that feels so justified removes paranoia. This allows competitors and a changing world to creep in unnoticed. So if you have some success and then you take your foot off the gas, somebody else is going to come and take you over the way you took over. Somebody else took their foot off the gas. And so you don't want to get lazy and complacent as soon as you have a little bit of success, because that will probably end up losing you the advantage that you worked so hard to gain. So you want to keep running, keep working, keep retaining that competitive advantage. And then in the end of the book, he has a list of kind of like questions you can ask about yourself in the future that I think are really powerful and they're worth pondering. He's probably got 15, 20 here. I'll just read you a couple of them because I think they're quite good. What do you desperately want to be true so much that you think it's true when it's clearly not? What looks unsustainable but is actually a new trend we haven't accepted yet? Are you prepared to handle risks you can't even envision? Which of your current views would change if your incentives were different? How much have things outside of your control contributed to things that you take credit for? Who do I look up to that is secretly miserable? And what strong belief do you hold that is most likely to change? Now, like I said, I really enjoyed the book. There's a lot of great ideas in here. It's not a long read. You'll probably find at least a couple chapters that resonate with you. So pick up a copy of Same as Ever by Morgan Housel. If you're enjoying this show, please like and subscribe on YouTube, leave a review wherever podcasts are sold, and send it to a friend, because that's the best way to make sure that I can keep doing this for you every week, and I'm really enjoying doing it. So I will see you next time.